Welcome to Veil of Time. Today we're asking some hard questions about violence in America and beyond, where outrage flares selectively and where it falls silent. Let's peel back the veil and see what's really going on. A surge of violent incidents. Over the recent holiday season, the United States saw a shocking list of violent incidents. A woman set on fire in a New York subway station. A man pushed onto the tracks on New Year's Eve. Multiple mass shootings in Illinois, Mississippi, Ohio, Chicago, New York, just days apart. How do people react? Many film the brutality and walk away or shrug it off as just another day. The same indifference emerges when tens of thousands are killed overseas. We pick and choose what to be horrified by, and that's a problem. Selective outrage and double standards. Take the driver who rammed into a crowd in New Orleans. Officials claim he pledged allegiance to ISIS. But where's the evidence? He was American-born, American-trained, a military veteran, like many who commit violence in the U.S. Meanwhile, the media narrative shifts to foreign radicalization. Why not question our own society, our own culture? Remember, the U.S. national homicide rate sits around 7 to 8 per 100,000, higher than most Western European countries and much higher than places like Germany, 1 per 100,000, or Japan, 0.2 to 0.3. Yet the finger often points outward, labeling all threats as foreign, comparing state homicide rates to Muslim-majority countries. Now let's look at Florida. Its homicide rate has hovered around 7.4 per 100,000. That's higher than Tunisia, 2 per 100,000. Turkey, 2 to 3 per 100,000. Malaysia, approximately 0.7 to 2.5 per 100,000, depending on the source. United Arab Emirates, approximately 0.3 to 0.6 per 100,000. Saudi Arabia, 0.8 to 1.0 per 100,000. It's even higher than estimates for Afghanistan, around 6 to 7 per 100,000, a country with ongoing conflict. Some figures suggest Florida might match or exceed the rate in Syria. It's important to note that most Muslim-majority countries with high violent death rates are also places torn by war or conflict, often involving some level of U.S. intervention, whether direct military action or support for proxy forces. By contrast, stable Muslim nations with little to no foreign military interference typically post very low homicide and violent crime rates, some even lower than many areas of the United States. If Washington claims to champion global peace, then why do the highest violent death rates in the Muslim world so often coincide with places under direct or indirect U.S. involvement? Yet we hear politicians, like a certain state senator, claim that Islam is the danger. If we compare raw data, many Muslim-majority countries have lower homicide rates than the most violent U.S. states. Mississippi at approximately 20 to 21 per 100,000. Louisiana at approximately 18 to 20 per 100,000. Alabama at approximately 14 to 15 per 100,000. Missouri at approximately 14 per 100,000. Numbers don't lie. Segment X, 4 of the most violent U.S. cities. We've talked about how the United States has certain states with higher homicide rates than many Muslim-majority countries. But let's zoom in further on 4 major U.S. cities that often top the charts for homicide. These are based on per capita rates, not total population. St. Louis, Missouri. Estimated homicide rate, approximately 60 per 100,000. Despite having fewer residents than some bigger metros, St. Louis routinely ranks among America's highest per capita homicide rates. Baltimore, Maryland. Estimated homicide rate, approximately 58 per 100,000. Known for ongoing struggles with gun violence, Baltimore's homicide numbers regularly push it into the top tier of U.S. cities by homicide rate. Birmingham, Alabama. Estimated homicide rate, approximately 50 per 100,000. Birmingham's homicide rate remains significantly higher than both the state average and the national average, mirroring broader regional trends in the Deep South. Memphis, Tennessee. Estimated homicide rate, approximately 44 per 100,000. Memphis has seen a surge in violent crime in recent years, placing it among the country's most dangerous metro areas on a per capita basis. As you look at these rates, keep in mind these cities are not alone. Others, like Jackson, Mississippi, or New Orleans, Louisiana, sometimes eclipse these numbers. But these four serve as stark examples of how certain parts of the U.S. experience exceptionally high levels of gun violence and homicide, far beyond the national average of 7 to 8 per 100,000. It's easy to talk about foreign threats and radical ideologies, yet these numbers show a harsh reality. Many American cities match or exceed homicide rates found in conflict zones overseas. If the goal is truly to protect American lives, these glaring domestic issues can't be downplayed or swept aside. Who's radicalizing? Whom? When an American veteran commits violence at home, we blame radical ideology. Yet in 2024 alone, as implied by some sources, we saw hundreds of mass shootings, and nearly all were carried out by people raised in American society. People exposed to violent media, a gun culture, and an environment that normalizes lethal force. If extremism is about absorbing violent narratives, then it's worth asking. Are more Americans radicalized by Hollywood, by unchecked gun policy, by societal indifference to human life? Consider ex-Muslims and extremist Muslims. Ironically, both often rely on Western misrepresentations of Islam. One side uses these distortions to hate Islam, the other side uses them to act violently, often against fellow Muslims. Both are products of a non-Islamic narrative that warps what Islam teaches. Defining terrorism and ignoring homegrown violence. Look at the inconsistency in how terrorism is labeled. A man blows up his van in downtown Nashville, called a suicide, no, not terrorism. People board the NYC subway with Molotov cocktails. Barely news. An active duty Green Beret detonates a truck in Las Vegas. Somehow not terrorism. Meanwhile, bombs dropped on hospitals and schools abroad are justified as counter-terror operations. To much of the world, this reeks of double standards. Some acts get labeled terrorism to spark national fear, while others, equally brutal, are dismissed as mere crimes. A culture of violence. Year after year, the U.S. records 500-plus mass shootings annually, tens of thousands of gun deaths, 40-plus school shootings in some years. Yet public outrage ebbs and flows depending on media framing. Politicians exploit certain incidents for power plays but ignore the rest. Entertainment markets glorify violence in music, TV, films, and games. Then we see real life reflect that casual brutality. On a global scale, violence from Western forces is still widespread, hitting some of the world's poorest regions. Meanwhile, inside the U.S., tragedies are daily news, and many Americans feel powerless, unsure how to combat a system that profits from fear and conflict. The irony of spreading values. Some leaders say, we need to export our values around the world. But what if those values boil down to endless war, mass incarceration, and rampant homicide rates? In many Muslim-majority nations, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, Brunei, official homicide rates are extremely low, usually under 1 per 100,000. People are often far safer there than in America's most violent neighborhoods. Is it any wonder some Americans fear that Muslim immigration might change the culture? If a community arrives that reduces overall violence, fosters family cohesion, and questions excessive militarism, how does that challenge the status quo? Conclusion and call to action. When asked, why won't you condemn the New Orleans truck attack? We do condemn it. We condemn all violence, no matter the perpetrator, no matter the victim. But let's be honest, the biggest threat to American lives right now is homegrown violence. The United States has turned casual brutality into an everyday experience. If you're angered by a terror label here or there, great, be consistent. Speak out when entire U.S. cities feel like war zones. Speak out against bombing schools overseas. Speak out for a culture that values all human life. Ultimately, if America wants to stand on the moral high ground, it must address its own homicide rates and societal violence, just as fiercely as it points the finger elsewhere. Thank you for joining me on Veil of Time. Let's keep questioning, keep searching, and keep pushing for a more just and peaceful world. Like if you found this discussion insightful. Subscribe for deeper dives into global and social issues. Comment below, what changes do you think could reduce violence everywhere?